Thank you so much, everyone. So I know we've heard a lot from the think tank community and also from a number of large and small companies. This panel is a little bit interesting because we do have a number of individuals from law enforcement and government agencies here with us today. I wanted to introduce myself, and I wanted to have each of these panelists also give a few minutes on their background and their relationship to content moderation. All of you guys have heard Jacob speak earlier, but he can give a little bit more about his particular role in Wikimedia. So let me first begin. As Tim mentioned, I am currently serving as Chief Technology Officer of the Interagency Countering Violent Extremism Task Force. I am also working on a new team at Homeland Security that Dan will be explaining a little bit more on, focused on countering foreign influence. And so we're really looking at this issue from a government perspective in the domestic space. I'll hand it over to Jacob.
Yeah. So as I introduced myself this morning, I work for the Wikimedia Foundation and I'm legal counsel. I, in particular, do work with law enforcement requests that the foundation receives. I want to clarify a little bit that because the foundation is a relatively small organization, we may not be representative of all the different companies out there. I think some large companies receive a lot of different requests. We receive a small number of requests, but I think we are representative in that our requests can vary in what they encompass, from requests for a single individual person to requests for readership over a period of time that could represent the data of many millions of people in certain circumstances. And so in that respect, we do represent the range that websites can offer in terms of what information law enforcement is looking for. A sort of quick addition of the type of work that we do with law enforcement. When we receive lawful requests, we of course make all efforts to comply with them. In many cases, a lot of the work goes into determining what data is actually available and helping to work and negotiate with law enforcement about what data they're actually looking for to clarify. In many cases, what a website possesses varies from what people are looking for. For example, we might have technical information but not actually have a person's address or phone number in some cases. And in some cases, we look to help clarify and negotiate in order to narrow certain requests, because there are times where what someone is looking to do and what information they're looking for is really just to find a particular person. But if you have a request for millions of people, we hope to be able to assist in narrowing that down to make everybody's life easier and to not give away the information of 999,000 unrelated people. So I will hand it over.
And Pablo is from the EU Internet Forum. Europol, sorry.
Europol,
so, sorry.
Well, my name is Pablo Peláez. I represent Europol here in the States. Despite we cover the entire Americas, my colleague Pat and I deal with some 18,000 law enforcement entities here in the States. And Europol is, as you know, or if you don't know, is the European Law Enforcement Agency. First of all, we are not the United States of Europe, okay? So we have to really deal with different sensitivities at EU level. In 1993, we created Europol, which initially was called the European Drugs Unit, that later on turned into Europol. And our main areas of expertise are cybercrime, counterterrorism, migrant smuggling, and organized crime. So a quite recent and important part of that is the cybercrime and city-related offenses, and the Internet Referral Unit that was created in 2015, it's quite a relevant actor in this arena. So we were created by, the Internet Referral Unit was created by the Council of Ministers, Justice and Home Affairs, with the idea of supporting all the counterterrorism investigations in terms of hate speech and online propaganda, trying to counter the message, trying to identify and refer the content to the private sector. But we've been somehow advancing, and we have been improving our methods that we will elaborate a bit more in the next minutes. But so far, we are in a very good position within the EU landscape in the deterrence of the hate speech and the online radicalism. So we can just discuss it more in depth later.
Wonderful. And Dan? Dan Sutherland?
Yeah, my name is Dan Sutherland, and I'm the Associate General Counsel of the Department of Homeland Security. I am the General Counsel for the part of Department of Homeland Security that's responsible for cybersecurity, biometrics, telecommunications, infrastructure resilience, and some other issues like that. I'll just mention the very beginning of the department. I was the first officer for civil rights and civil liberties at the department, and that'll be relevant, I think, as we talk about some of the legal frameworks that we're going to talk about in a bit. The reason why I was asked to sit in this panel is Secretary Nielsen has stood up a Countering Foreign Influence Task Force and asked me to lead that while we're trying to think through as a department how to manage that space. And essentially, again, we'll talk about this more later, but essentially what we're talking about there is malign actors, foreign governments and foreign actors who seek to use traditional media or new media in ways that seek to sow discord among our population, confuse our population, create fissures or divisions among our population. And we're trying to think of how to wrap our arms around that problem set. So that's kind of the mission of this Countering Foreign Influence Task Force that I've been asked to lead, and that we're very fortunate to have Clara serving on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those great introductions, everyone. So we're going to start off from the left side of the panel to the right. So Dan, you just mentioned the Countering Foreign Influence Task Force at DHS. Could you perhaps cover from a law enforcement or government agency perspective how the U.S. government has been dealing with types of illicit content online, just the overall framework? And then Pablo, perhaps you can give a much more EU perspective as well. Dan, probably some of the challenges in the domestic space especially.
Okay, so I think Claire would like for me to lay out some of the legal frameworks here, and the problem is we're missing a colleague who would be from the law enforcement context, someone who would answer that question maybe from the FBI. I am not that, as you heard. We're looking at the countering foreign influence space, but not from a law enforcement perspective. We work very closely in this task force, very closely with the FBI, but their perspective on the issue is different because they're in the law enforcement space. So I'm sorry with my limitations on what I can answer, but Pablo's going to do the law enforcement piece for us. So obviously the first issue, which has really been underlying all of our discussions here today, is the Constitution, and particularly the First Amendment of the Constitution, which protects speech. And it's very important, we talk about this all the time in conversations ever since 9/11, that it's not a violation of any law for someone to go to a website that maybe has content that's neo-Nazi or ISIS related or something. That's not a violation of any law. There are so the range of what the First Amendment protects is really important for us to understand, and for us as we're thinking about government action to understand in terms of the context of that framework. I think it's also important that we understand and mull over and let seep into our bones the values underlying the Constitution, government involvement in speech, government influencing speech, government coercing speech. All these are things that we as a country don't feel comfortable with, and it underlines the values of the Constitution. There's obviously a lot of relevant statutes, such as the Privacy Act, and within our department, we have built into, the Congress has built into the structure of our department some of these principles. We have a chief privacy officer and a privacy office. The first privacy officer was Nuala O'Connor, who's now the head of Center for Democracy and Technology. I have to say that since they're a sponsor of the conference to mention that. But anyway, and I was the first officer for civil rights and civil liberties, and the two of us sat together and tried to figure out how do we make sense of all this. But both of these are statutorily created positions that are very well funded, and both have very substantial places at the table within the department. I think both offices have 50 plus people, maybe 100 people spread out across the department, budgets in the order of $20 million. This is resourced, it's meaningful, or both are meaningful organizations within the department have influence on how we think about issues. So the other thing that I'll mention about legal frameworks is, as we're thinking about both foreign influence and countering violent extremism, we are thinking within the framework of of legal constructs that are very typical for the Department of Homeland Security, and by that I mean really information sharing. A lot of what the Department of Homeland Security is all about is information sharing. That threat information, for example, would get down to state and local leaders, to sheriffs, mayors, governors, others like that. And so we're thinking about these problem sets from an information sharing context. For example, we statutorily can create and do create forums for industry and government to discuss sensitive security information. And there's statutory provisions that are created that would allow a shopping mall or a train station or whatever to share with us sensitive security information, and for us to have a discussion, meaningful discussion about that. That applies in this context as well. So we are structured as a department to have these types of relationships with the private sector, social media companies, to help them think through the security issues that they face, and for us to brainstorm together and think through these issues together. So it's a completely different paradigm than my colleague from the FBI or Paulo would provide. It's an important addition, I think, in terms of a legal framework.
Yeah, well, when it comes to just a small clarification, when it comes to foreign influence, Europol is not dealing with that. That falls more into the intel side, so we are not that much into countering foreign influence in our systems. So I will be referring to CVE, so violent extremism, and also the propaganda or the means used by those who are recruiting or bringing refugees or migrants. So all the false promises and everything that are being disseminated through internet in order to recruit them. And to be honest, for us as Europol, is not, we mentioned in the past, it's not difficult because we rely so much on member states. So Europol, until quite recently, we didn't have such an authority. So even the referrals that we had to make had to go through the different national authorities that were dealing with the judicial proceedings at national level. Once again, we are not the United States of Europe. However, how can we just face this challenge since the beginning? Well, counting with all the actors since the very beginning, meaning that relying too much on the European Union Internet Forum, which is a platform that really brings together people from the decision-making, all the policymakers. You have as well Europol, you have the member states, and you have the private industry. So by bringing all the people to the table since the first moment, that allows for a much optimal result. That is the model that was set up by Europol with the Cybercrime Center in 2013. Okay, so we decided that we needed to really have the private industry with us in order to be able to really develop the different policies at the EU level. And the advisory board of the Cybercrime Center is comprised of some of the big companies, but also the small ones. So we really take into account, we take on board all the initiatives that can be brought by the private sector, and we try to include them in our strategy. At the end, when we are dealing with the removal of information, when we are facing the challenge of taking out of the market this speech, we really refer to your own or to the private industry's own guidelines. So it's the way we see it is we are helping them in cleaning their platforms. So in that regard, the more we know, the more we understand each other, the better results we have.
No, that's wonderful. And Pablo, another question for you. How do you guys work with the private sector? How do you determine which companies to work with? What does that interaction look like in more detail?
Well, that is a challenge for us. It's a continuous outreach exercise. So we identify platforms, 150, 160 platforms. So far, we are in contact with no less than 80, as far as I know. And the way we act, in 2016, we set up an internet referral platform, management tool, to access directly the different companies. By this, we've been able, since 2015, if I'm not mistaken, to analyze more than 54,000 leads, out of which 52,000 out of them were referred, and we have an 82% success rate, which is, I think, quite impressive. Member states, as mentioned at the beginning, they were the ones who had to refer. However, since this management tool has been so effective, we are getting requests from member states to use our platform to access the different platforms. And we are establishing a pilot project because so far all the work we've done with the private sector has been done through our encrypted tools, but we are thinking on the best way to bring it out to the regular internet, of course with the appropriate safeguards, and have the different member states accessing the platform in a coordinated manner. And that is probably one of the big challenges that we have that we can discuss later, which is coordination in the referrals.
No, absolutely. That's very insightful. So Jacob, we're going to turn it over to you. Wanted to see if you could help outline a little bit more detail how you guys work specifically with law enforcement. And I understand you have a little bit of a different model. You don't have 20,000 employees to do content moderation by the end of the year like Facebook. You have a little bit less, and you rely on a different type of model really on your community. So if you could deep dive into that a little bit, and also how you handle law enforcement requests.
Yeah, so I think there's a certain subset of things relating to law enforcement that I think are actually fairly easy to deal with, both in our model at Wikimedia that uses community editing, as well as for many other platforms that have moderators they've hired to do that kind of work, which is things that are like fraudulent or deceptive in some way, and things that are clearly threats and calls to violence, because both of those two examples, of which much of the violent extremism content is, as well as much of the government influence content, are things that there is pretty general agreement that people don't want around. So on Wikipedia, the primary effort that people are going to is writing an encyclopedia. Many of the user policies are specifically around identification of reliable sources and trustworthy information. And as soon as people find out that something that seemed to be a reliable source is in fact a fraud, or that something is not actually a reliable source at all, it is advocating for extremist acts and is not seen as anything trustworthy at all, they will take it out of Wikipedia. And so the primary effort, I think, is actually in identification of issues. So one way that those can be identified is for them to be pointed out by law enforcement, and I think most of us are grateful for when that happens, because that is a great way to identify a problem. Some of that also goes back into the machine learning efforts that are going on. I think that looking at edits that are done and being able to identify when something is advocating for violence, or if there are indicia of fraud or deception in some way, are ongoing things. Those tools are unfortunately imperfect, so you're never going to find everything, but the better and better they get, the more likely it is that someone is going to be able to find things and respond to them quickly and effectively. I still think that human review is really important. In fact, we had a great example of that in the lunch talk that just finished, where you might have a video that in its origin is violent in some way, but is then shared by people advocating for world peace and as an example of the problems going on, and those kind of issues are caught by human reviewers, whether they're volunteers or hired moderators, and so can be evaluated more carefully. Where I do think that there is more difficulty is that subset of things that are felt to be in the space of sort of propaganda, but that are also accurate and newsworthy in some way and are not a clear call to violence. So for example, some of the writings of some of the various clerics, for example, are often used by people to advocate for terrorist acts, but are not themselves calling for violence, and are not clearly inaccurate or wrong, and may even be things that are newsworthy and that people want to talk about. And our model at Wikimedia is this various community model, so as long as it does seem to be lawful content, we allow the communities to make their own decisions about what they want to say about that and how they want to write about that. But I do think that those present some challenges in a law enforcement space where there's a need to identify people that are using that content as ways to communicate amongst networks. And so I think that is also probably where the legal challenge is most notable, and there hasn't been a lot of precedent around First Amendment and Fourth Amendment law in that space. The other thing I would say about this overall is that the other types of requests that we get from law enforcement for identifying people, I think that those also fall into sort of two categories. There are requests where it is clear that there is a problem, there are people that are engaged in some kind of wrongdoing, and we are able to help with those as much as we are able given the technical limitations and what information we possess. There's also sometimes a subset of requests that are a little more fishing expedition in nature, and I think are often made not because the government is not trying to do something good, but just because they're not sure what information is there or what the company has available. And I think when that kind of request does come in, the responsibility of the company dealing with it is to help educate and work with the government to figure out what is desired and to help protect the rights of users where those are at issue in that situation.
And Jacob, I know that prior to this panel, you had mentioned briefly about Wikimedia's unique model and that a number of other content platforms are actually citing Wikimedia. And could you explain a little bit more about that? I think the audience might find it.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that the Wikipedia volunteer communities as a whole are really good at is producing accurate information. It's a model with a lot of people all writing articles, checking sources, and there's pretty good agreement about what makes for a reliable source, things like well-established reputation, a good journalistic process, things like that. And so because the entire effort of writing an encyclopedia is to produce accurate articles with good sources, and because the content is freely reusable by anyone for any purpose, what a number of other platforms have been doing is linking to Wikipedia articles. So for example, YouTube recently started linking to Wikipedia articles and videos that are marked as controversial, and I believe Facebook has also started to do some of that. And I think that is useful. It's certainly one very helpful use of Wikipedia content, and so we'll see what happens from there.
Wonderful. So I know we spent a little bit of time talking about terrorist propaganda, and I know that Pablo, you may not have worked in this space just yet, but both to Jacob and to Dan, would love to hear a little bit more about how the U.S. government and also from the private sector, from you, Jacob, is thinking about issues like countering foreign influence. How are you starting to think about the model, Jacob, at Wikimedia Foundation? And then Dan, could you expand upon a little bit of the efforts that you talked about earlier? Dan, do you want to start?
Okay, great, I'll start. As I said, Secretary Nielsen has established a task force on countering foreign influence. And the problem set there that we're looking at, as I said before, is we're looking at foreign governments or foreign actors who seek to sow discord or drive divisions, fissures within our society, to understand that problem set and then to identify actions that the government can helpfully take in that context. So we have, throughout this conference today, we have talked about a whole range of really interesting problems that society faces, and this problem we haven't actually talked about. It's another emerging problem, and so I want to talk, I think it's important to think about that as particularly we're heading toward midterm elections, as kind of another measuring stick in which this is going to be an issue, and we will be increasingly wrapping our arms around this problem. And we're not approaching it as a law enforcement agency would. A law enforcement agency would naturally and appropriately approach a social media company and say, we have X account or X person associated with these accounts under investigation, and we'd like information about that, or that might ask for certain sites or information to be taken down. Our approach is instead in the area of supporting our partners and stakeholders in understanding the scope and scale of this problem, and then identifying ways that they can take actions with regard to it. Rather than our department taking actions, we can empower a social media company, a university, a company, a state election official to take the actions that they deem appropriate. So our model is in supporting our stakeholders rather than in a law enforcement model coming to them about a specific case. These two, we work very closely with the FBI on this. These two are very complementary and important roles, but I think not quite discussed here at this conference. But I have to say, I think we're going to be increasingly talking about it more and more. So what we're doing here in the early days of this is really trying to wrap our arms around this problem set. We're meeting with, well, for example, we've looked at every single think tank report and congressional report written on this and summarized all the different recommendations that people are saying government should take. We're sitting with social media companies, poring over those ideas. Everything that we're doing is in lockstep with our privacy office and our Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. They've asked me to lead it because I'm a lawyer and because of my civil liberties background. I mean, the Secretary has just determined that we're not going to take steps in this space that are not fully consistent with the law and the Constitution. So we're trying to lay a strong foundation here, and then in the next the upcoming months and weeks, I think we're going to see rolling out of a strategy that the department can implement, something that we want to be very transparent to the public about how we're approaching these issues, and then really rolling up our sleeves with social media companies to find out what are their requirements, how could we help them, is there information we could push to them, is there training that we could help their either 6 or 20,000, whichever the company happens to be, content moderators to understand what this problem is that they're even looking at. So there's a whole range of issues like that we would be looking at, but the model, I think, is different than a traditional law enforcement model.
Yeah, Pablo.
If I may, even if it's not directly focused on the foreign influence, but what you have said, and also Jacob, is what is really needed is a full understanding of what the other part needs. In that sense, we are working on a 3-year project with the European Commission. It's been funded by the European Commission, and that is intended to bring all the expertise to the table. We are producing guidelines, so people understand, and law enforcement agencies, very much supported by the U.S. government, understands what the companies need to make effective the requests, and that is fully needed. We are also setting a toolkit with, so far has, I think, 18 different open source intelligence tools that will allow both the OSPs, I mean the service providers, and the law enforcement to identify and detect the content. We need to learn from each other's experience, and even on top of that, we have put in place the so-called targeted action days, by which we really target, if it's a big platform, just one, if not a few platforms. We make them aware of it. We coordinate our work with them, so we both learn from the experience. They get the information on the content, and they have to remove it, but we also get information on the way and the hurdles they need to really overcome to be able to deal with these issues. So it is very important in both ways. We provide them with the modus operandi, and since the internal referral unit is fully embedded in our counterterrorism center, we also provide modus operandi trends that will help later on the companies in identifying these patterns.
Great. And Jacob, I know you deal with murky types of rulings on content all the time on Wikimedia. So I think around a broader issue that may not have specific legal implications like foreign influence. Curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think what both Dan and Pablo were saying is really pretty right, that like what we need on the tech company side is information about what's going on. In many cases, we at the companies, I think even in the case with larger companies with large staffs, there's just too much stuff to review everything and to know what's going on. And so as specific as possible information about what is happening is really helpful. I think in particular that actually like publication, like investigation and publication of information can be especially helpful, Because there's one level where something is like, I get an email from a law enforcement agency and they're saying there's a particular person they're investigating, or there's a problem, or even there's a subpoena and they need information on someone, and that can stop, you know, one person or one particular problematic article. But if there's an investigation into, say, like an agency or an organization that is producing a lot of fake content, and that's published in a way that lets people identify everything originating from that organization as a deception, then that can be disseminated out and used either in, you know, algorithms identifying content or looking for different types of links, or by volunteers editing content to, you know, remove all of that or declare it all to be unreliable in different ways. So the more information is generally known about these kind of problems, the easier it is on the tech company side to respond to it, I think.
No, that's wonderful. So we're going to close today with more of an emerging issue as we go into coffee break. Encourage all of you guys to also discuss this. How will the introduction of the Clarifying Lawful Overseas Use of Data Act, the Cloud Act, impact all of your guys' work? So maybe Jacob, we'll start with you. How are you guys thinking about that at Wikimedia? And any questions you have for maybe Pablo from the law enforcement side?
Yeah. So I think so for those who don't know, the Cloud Act does two things. The first one is it gives US law enforcement the right to access data held by US companies, no matter where the physical location of that data is. There was a case going on about Microsoft holding data in Ireland and not giving it to US authorities, and the Cloud Act mooted that case, and now they just have to turn that over. The second thing it does is it opens up a program by which, I believe it's the DOJ in consultation with the Secretary of State, can make bilateral agreements with various foreign countries in order to allow those foreign countries to make law enforcement requests directly to tech companies, and those tech companies would be allowed to comply with those requests. Right now, the Stored Communications Act prevents US companies from voluntarily giving data to foreign law enforcement authorities. Those countries which negotiate an agreement under the Cloud Act would have that restriction lifted and could comply with those foreign requests. And so I think those two parts are sort of, there's an immediate effect from the first one. There's no bilateral agreements yet, but we'll see what comes from those. So the first thing is, I think the first part just clarifies what pretty much everybody was already doing, with a few exceptions like the Microsoft problem, right? If you are a US company and you get a lawful request from US law enforcement, a US company has to comply with that. I don't expect that to be a significant change from what most people are doing. There may still be some exceptions. I think there was some mention over the day of GDPR in Europe. That could present some challenges if data is being held in Europe and requested by US law enforcement. So that is an area of law to be clarified under the Cloud Act. The second part, I think the question with the bilateral agreements is going to be twofold. One is whether there will be many that are actually created. If they are, then there's likely to be a lot more direct requests from foreign law enforcement, and that could, you know, lead to a notable increase in the kinds of requests we're receiving and maybe make it more difficult to evaluate them. And the second part is what those requests are impacting. The Cloud Act has some exceptions for if requests are impacting free expression or freedom of speech. And you know, like in the case of Wikipedia, for example, if somebody's asking who's reading a particular Wikipedia article, I would argue that that's likely to impact free expression, because that's very much a modern analog of what library books you're checking out. But it's not going to be clear that that will be as difficult for every company equally. So I think we'll have to see what kinds of bilateral agreements are created, and then what types of requests foreign authorities are making under that. If people are asking for a lot more data, and a lot more data in those sort of controversial spaces, that could lead to some challenges or maybe a little bit of need for clarification of the law going forward.
Pablo, any thoughts?
Oof, it's very challenging because, I mean, Jacob has already mentioned a lot. But, of course, with the GDPR, the General Protection Data Protection Regulation coming into force in a couple of weeks, it's very unclear, the panorama. I mean, the landscape is going to be, we anticipate that being the Cloud Act kind of a BILAT-led initiative, that would conflict a little bit with the more generic and multilateral legislation. We, of course, being from the European Union, we advocate for a joint tackling of of the threat. So it is very important that the communication it's not a double way, meaning that we have feedback from the company and therefore allowing us to have more accurate requests in the future, but also multilateral, so a horizontal approach. We will have the e-evidence regulation coming over in just not that long time in the future. So we anticipate an overlapping in the legislation and conflicting parts of the regulation, which is not what we are looking for. But I don't know. Time will tell. We'll see.
No, absolutely. And speaking of time, I think our time is up. So please thank all the panelists. If you have specific questions, please tweet at us or tweet at Como, and we'll be able to follow up individually. Unfortunately, we're out of time for questions from everyone here in the crowd, but please thank our panelists.